I received my PhD at Rice University in 1980 under the direction of George J. Schroepfer Jr., who, as it turns out, was a PhD student of Ivan France. He was talking about France, and then we were talking about, well, could you really help yourself by lowering certain cholesterol? Was changing your diet worthwhile? So he said this study was very carefully done and hadn't been published at that point. And he said the most amazing thing was the strongest correlation in the study was that the people who ate the most deep fried foods lived the longest. And he said, France didn't like that. He didn't like that idea of fatty foods being good for you or animal products being good for you. Well, I think that he just was very, very careful, and he was skeptical of his own results. He had prejudices, as we know, that he felt that lowering certain cholesterol was good for you, and he didn't like.
If biology has an Indiana Jones, it's Christopher Ramsden. Ramsden currently works in a clinical investigation unit studying the effects of lipid peroxidation on degenerative disease. Lipid peroxidation is the process of breaking down fat molecules, a process exclusive to the polyunsaturated fats we have been told to eat more of. In 2011, he began reading into some of the available evidence testing the diet-heart hypothesis. This hypothesis states that dietary saturated fat raises blood cholesterol, which causes heart disease. It struck him as odd when he realized the largest experiment to ever be conducted on the subject, the Minnesota Coronary Survey from the mid-70s, was largely incomplete. The two men who conducted the study, Ivan France Jr. and Ancel Keys, had already passed away by then, so Ramsden contacted France's children. Dr. Ivan France III responded, "I told him I recalled lots and lots of records. Whole chests full of records, IBM computer tapes, back in Minnesota." Dr. Robert France, now a physician at the Mayo Clinic, drove an hour and a half to his childhood home to search for evidence. He found some decaying, unlabeled boxes tucked away in the basement. Inside were ancient magnetic computer tapes and reams of yellow documents. The subject line in his email to Ramsden was, "Eureka." Once Ramsden and his team got a hold of the records and converted them into data recognizable by today's computers, he knew why they had been hidden for over 4 decades. The Minnesota Coronary Survey randomized individuals into 2 groups, a control diet or a diet designed to lower blood cholesterol. The control diet was still relatively high in the polyunsaturated fat linoleic acid, even higher than the patient's baseline diet by about 38%. This diet was higher in saturated fat than the experimental group, but was also significantly higher in artificial trans fat. Ancel Keys and Ivan France were well aware of the cholesterol-raising effects of trans fat, and likely added them to be the control diet for this effect. Keep in mind that artificial trans fats have since been banned from the food supply by the FDA because they were no longer generally recognized as safe. Do you know how bad something had to be in order for the FDA to ban it? We're talking about an organization that allows pharmaceuticals with side effects of coma and death on the market without second thought.
And in extreme cases can lead to coma or death. Other risks include increased cholesterol.
Oh, and by the way, do you know where artificial trans fats come from? The hydrogenation process during the production of, you guessed it, vegetable oil. With all of this considered, the control diet was far from a healthy one. We don't know exactly what they were eating outside of the types and amounts of fat, but I seriously doubt that the food from nursing homes and mental hospitals in the 60s was top quality. Add on top of that the large amount of trans fats and the fact that the diet still contained at least twice the amount of linoleic acid found in ancestral diets. The linoleic acid content was about 4.7% of calories, which many would argue is still far too high. The intervention group cut the saturated fat intake in half from 18.5% down to 9.2% of calories. Current dietary recommendations have the cap for saturated fat intake at 10% of calories. This diet also increased the polyunsaturated intake from a baseline of 3.2% to 13.2%. In one of the most important experiments in human history, Ramsden and his group found the exact opposite of Keys and France's hypothesis. Well, kind of. The group that replaced saturated fat for vegetable oil did substantially lower their blood cholesterol levels. Mission accomplished. However, what we actually care about, the outcomes, were contrary to the diet-heart hypothesis. The risk of death increased by 22% for every 30 milligram per deciliter drop in blood cholesterol. Among those who died during the trial, 41% of the vegetable oil group had at least one heart attack compared to 22% in the saturated fat group. I will re-emphasize once again that the control diet was still high in polyunsaturated fat and included more artificial trans fat. Stephen Brast, a student at the University of Minnesota at the time, used the full set of data for his master's thesis in 1981. When asked about why this information was never published, he suggested that at least part of the reason for the incomplete publication of the data might have been human nature. The Minnesota investigators had a theory that they believed in, that reducing blood cholesterol would make people healthier. Indeed, the idea was widespread and would soon be adopted by the federal government in the first dietary recommendations. So when the data they collected from the mental patients conflicted with his theory, the scientists may have been reluctant to believe what their experiment had turned up. The results flew in the face of what people believed at the time, said Brast. Everyone thought cholesterol was the culprit. This theory was so widely held and so firmly believed, and then it wasn't borne out by the data. Just as my own professor had heard from France himself, the results were not published because they did not agree with his hypothesis. The idea that there might be something adverse about lowering cholesterol via vegetable oils was really antithetical to the dogma of the day, Bob France said. The experiment my professor alluded to and the one that Ramsden investigated, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, was a double-blinded, randomized controlled trial. These are considered the gold standard for evidence in any field of research. These are studies that will randomize subjects into groups and blind them, meaning they don't know whether they are in the control or experimental group. Double blinding is incredibly rare in nutrition studies because food is hard to disguise. I mean, think about it. Imagine you're doing a study comparing a whole foods plant-based diet to a whole foods animal-based diet. How are you going to get this to look like this? As much as Beyond Meat wants you to believe that the taste is indistinguishable, we know that's not the case.
All the legendary flavor, none of the meat.
It's not easy or even possible most of the time. However, when just swapping out the saturated fats for polyunsaturated lookalikes, it is relatively easy to give someone the decoy without them knowing the difference. In fact, I guarantee it's been done to you at some point. Randomized controlled trials, especially when blinded, are much better at proving causation than observational studies are. In nutrition science, observational or epidemiological studies usually involve giving people a questionnaire to fill out what they think they ate, which ends up gathering notoriously inaccurate data. This is a crucial point. Science is where it is today because we constantly challenge our beliefs and only come to conclusions when the data is irrefutable. Even then, they are still tested repeatedly. Correlations are important, but not for drawing conclusions, for making hypotheses. Those hypotheses do not become fact until proven. For some reason, likely because the experiments are very expensive and difficult to conduct, nutrition science is one of the only fields where associations are taken as gospel. In 2013, Ramsden tracked down the only surviving author of another study, a man named Boonsang Leelarthapen. This was the Sydney Diet Heart Study. I knew in my mind where it was, he said. He went in his garage in Sydney and started moving old piles of boxes. It did take quite some time. I opened up all the boxes. There were a lot of old books and different things, like hard copies of published papers, he said. Buried deep in the pile, he found what Dr. Christopher Ramsden was anxious to see. An obsolete 9-track magnetic computer tape from the original Sydney Diet Heart Study. It was an unremarkable-looking brown spool with a faded 3M label that had the words Lee 3 printed in blue ink. Ramsden said, the recovery actually took a substantial amount of time because it was in a format that wasn't readable by today's standards. Dr. Ramsden tracked down some old equipment, recruited some experts, and after much technical hand-wringing and format configuring, the data was translated into modern computer language so that it could be reanalyzed and interpreted. When asked why the full data wasn't included, Leelarthapen's answer was just as expected, because we couldn't explain it. Well, actually you could have, but you were too dogmatic about your original hypothesis to admit you were wrong. Thankfully, Leelarthapen did help Ramsden and the crew work on the updated analysis, even if it took 40 years. Ramsden did an updated analysis of the study, now with the complete data. The study was a simple saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat swap. The results? After 7 years on their respective diets, 17.6% of the vegetable oil group had died compared to just 11.8% of the saturated fat group. Mind you, this is in men aged 30 to 59, so they weren't just dying of old age. In fact, the numbers are nearly identical for cardiovascular disease and mortality. When controlling for smoking and age, the results were the same. In order to understand the significance of both the Minnesota Coronary Survey and the Sydney Diet Heart Study and why the real results were hidden for so long, we need to look at the history. In 1913, researchers Anitskow and Chatalov had an idea to test the diet-heart hypothesis. They gave rabbits purified cholesterol dissolved in sunflower oil and induced plaques that were observed to resemble lesions in humans. Keep in mind that rabbits are herbivores who consume no dietary cholesterol in nature. They used rabbits fed sunflower oil without cholesterol as controls and noticed no lesions in those rabbits. Before this cholesterol/seed oil concoction was fed to the rabbits, colleagues of the researchers were able to induce atherosclerosis in the rabbits by feeding them meat, eggs, and milk. Thus born the diet-heart hypothesis. However, when the cholesterol was injected directly into their bloodstream, they did not get heart disease, a gaping hole in the hypothesis that has since been completely forgotten or intentionally ignored. My bet would be on the latter. When the same methods were used on rats and dogs, they failed to produce the same results. Unlike rabbits, rats and dogs can efficiently convert cholesterol into bile acid. The American Heart Association was and continues to be an incredibly powerful and influential organization in nutrition. However, it wasn't always this way. Founded in 1924, the AHA struggled to even stay alive for around 2 decades. By the mid-1920s, heart disease had become the leading cause of death in America. And the AHA was originally a small group of early cardiovascular researchers. These men set out to try and piece together the earliest available information. There was no consensus at the time, hence the need for a group coming together to discuss the topic. In 1946, the renowned textbook Quantitative Clinical Chemistry concluded that, although there can be no doubt that the deposits of lipids, especially cholesterol, are consistent and characteristic features of atherosclerotic lesions, there is no indication that hypercholesterolemia plays more than a contributory role in their production. This sentiment was shared by most doctors across the world at the time. That was until 1948, when the makers of the first ever vegetable oil, Procter & Gamble, revitalized the American Heart Association by donating all of the proceeds from a radio contest to the AHA.
The American Heart Association really was nothing to look at until Procter & Gamble came along in 1948, and they designated them to be the recipient of this Jack Benny radio show contest. It's called the Walking Men Contest, where all the proceeds from the show went to the American Heart Association. And as the American Heart Association's own history book reads, it says, and overnight, millions poured into our coffers. As the Procter & Gamble man, they had a dinner, celebrated, and handed us the check. And overnight, they became a huge, massive nonprofit organization. They're still the biggest nonprofit in the U.S. today, all thanks to their launch by Procter & Gamble, whom they paid off.
This marked the beginning of the AHA as we know it, a conglomerate in all things related to health.
Ask your heart association how to reduce your risk of heart attack. It's one of the services you support when you give to the Heart Fund.
I find it funny how on the AHA's own page detailing their history, they say that in 1948, they reorganized and suddenly became a powerful organization with no mention of the funding from Procter & Gamble. In the mid-1950s, a physiologist named Ancel Keys, who supported the hypothesis that elevated blood cholesterol levels due to dietary fat intake cause heart disease. This is known to this day as the diet-heart hypothesis. Keys conducted an observational study known as the 7 Countries Study that was funded by organizations like the U.S. Public Health Service and the U.S. National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and most notably, the American Heart Association. From the 7 countries observed, it appeared that the higher the diet was in fat, the more that country suffered from cardiovascular disease mortality. He concluded that the countries that ate the most saturated fat died the most of heart disease. There's only one problem. He didn't study 7 countries. He studied 22, most of which conveniently didn't make the final cut. Keyes dismissed the data from other countries because of poor data collection. Meanwhile, many of the countries he did include were confounded. A reinvestigation of this study was made in 2017, and the authors point out the statisticians argued for high standards of evidence to reach conclusions about causality, but neglected to exclude countries with notoriously poor mortality statistics. Ancel Keys was showing his clear bias early on. It was one of the most popular studies in nutrition science history. In 1955, the nation had collectively gone into a frenzy over President Eisenhower's heart attack, and the government was committed to creating dietary recommendations that would reduce the risk of heart disease for the public. By the way, Eisenhower was also a chain smoker, but that also gets neglected. In 1956, the American Heart Association, who funded the 7-country study, proclaimed on national television that the consumption of saturated fats would lead to heart disease. This was a landmark in American history, as it was the first time that recommendations on nutrition were given to the general public. Keyes was very close to the people of the AHA. In fact, they have a lecture that still runs today called the Ancel Keys Lecture. Ironically, the same year they made the statement on saturated fat, the association stated, much greater knowledge is needed before conclusions can be drawn concerning possible relationships between tobacco smoking and increased death rates from coronary heart disease. The only evidence that smoking caused heart disease at the time was epidemiological, much like Keyes' 7 countries study. Apparently, they needed greater scientific rigor in order to establish causation for cigarettes, but the evidence coming from Ancel Keys' single study, which wasn't even an experiment and included manipulated data, was enough. The diet heart hypothesis became an incredibly important point of interest for the scientific community for the following years.
As you know, killer!
It's hard to understate the power and influence of Ancel Keys. Not only was he connected to the American Heart Association, he was also on the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the WHO Joint Expert Committee on Nutrition. I mean, the man to this day is the only scientist in the history of nutrition to be on the cover of Time magazine when he had the honor back in 1961. While the American Heart Association had issued their statement, the United States government took no position. Multiple clinical trials were conducted over the next 2 decades to truly test the hypothesis in order to give the best recommendations to the American public. In 1968, Senator George McGovern established his Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. This started an organization to ensure adequate foodstuffs to impoverished areas of the country. Once more research on the diet heart hypothesis was conducted, this panel of scientists ended up deciding what the dietary recommendations for the general public would be. One of the most prominent figures in the committee was Mark Hegsted, a researcher from Harvard. Hegsted was originally outspoken about the fact that sugar, and not saturated fat or cholesterol, was at the root of heart disease. That is, until he was involved in a lobbying scandal involving the sugar industry. In fact, he had a conversation with the vice president of the Sugar Research Foundation, John Hickson, who also happened to be a top sugar industry executive. We have an entire video on the foundation's numerous lobbying scandals, so check that out if you want to know more about them. Just to sum it up, Hegsted was co-author of a review article analyzing the available data to try and draw some conclusions about metabolic disorders like heart disease. Hickson is quoted telling Hegsted essentially that he wanted him to prove that sugar is not causal in heart disease. Hegsted replied that he would do just that. The review paper in fact did conclude that reducing dietary saturated fat was a necessary change in the prevention of heart disease. Hegsted had done a complete 180 and now was supposedly a believer in the diet heart hypothesis. So much so that in 1974 at a committee conference, when the topic of beef in the American diet was addressed, Hegsted vehemently argued for reduction in intake. While real experiments were being conducted, the diet heart hypothesis had become interpreted as fact by many, likely due to the American Heart Association's advocacy. Wanting to get in on the new wave of medicine, drug companies began funding researchers who would develop pharmaceuticals that could lower blood cholesterol. Japanese microbiologist Akira Endo, a researcher at the time, said in the 1950s and 1960s, many companies were searching for molecules that would block one of the 30 steps in the synthesis of cholesterol from acetyl coenzyme A. In fact, in 1968, the American Heart Association funded research that ended up developing cholestyramine, a cholesterol-lowering drug that is still used today. They are still very proud of this, advertising their investment on their funded research breakthroughs and their funded research milestone pages. In the early 70s, Endo discovered an antimicrobial agent that could lower blood cholesterol, and a new class of drugs was born. These drugs, the statins, started to show the ability to lower blood cholesterol in the mid to late 70s. One of the biggest drug companies in the world, Merck, was astonished with the results of the existing evidence. Merck and similar companies had been pumping millions, if not billions, of dollars into the development of these drugs. There was a lot of cash on the line, and to this day, the statin is the most profitable pharmaceutical ever created. While all this was happening, there were several observational and, more importantly, clinical studies done to investigate the diet-heart hypothesis. Two of the most important were the Sydney Diet-Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Survey. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment featured Ansel Keys himself as a co-principal investigator, along with my professor's advisor's advisor, Ivan France. These studies spanned multiple years, both starting in the late 60s and concluding in the early 70s. The results of the Minnesota experiment were first presented in 1975 at an American Heart Association conference, no less, with very little actual data, instead just stating the general results. There was no reported change in heart disease or mortality. George McGovern, meanwhile, had grown impatient with the scientific process and wanted to issue policy as soon as possible to boost his political status, regardless of the fact that there was still insufficient data. Even members of the committee who had subscribed to the diet-heart hypothesis were against issuing policy without conclusive evidence. Among those testifying was National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute Director Robert Levy. He is quoted saying, "We have no doubt that elevated blood cholesterol is associated with an increased risk of heart attack. We have no doubt that cholesterol can be lowered by diet and/or medication. Where the doubt exists is the question of whether lowering cholesterol will result in a reduced incidence of heart attack. It is unproven in clinical trials. The problem with all these trials is that none of them have showed a difference in heart attack or death rate in the treated group." However, McGovern continued to pressure the committee to make recommendations. The results of the Sydney Diet-Heart Study had yet to be released, and those of the Minnesota Coronary Survey were not officially published. In January of 1977, McGovern and his committee announced the dietary recommendations to reduce saturated fat intake and increase polyunsaturated fat intake for the prevention of heart disease, despite pushback from others in the field.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
Later that year, George V. Mann, a physician and nutrition expert at Vanderbilt University, dismissed the evidence from the dietary trials as totally unconvincing. In a New England Journal of Medicine review entitled Diet Heart, End of an Era, he suggested that the dietary dogma was a moneymaker for segments of the food industry, a fundraiser for the Heart Association, and busy work for thousands of fat chemists. To be a dissenter was to be unfunded because the peer review system rewards conformity and excludes criticism. George, I couldn't agree more. Just months later, the results of the Sydney Diet-Heart Study were published, except it excluded the most important piece of information, cardiovascular outcomes. It took until 1989 for the Minnesota experiment to be actually published. It received very little attention at the time since it was published in a relatively unknown journal created by the American Heart Association known as atherosclerosis at the time. You can't make this stuff up.
They're just making stuff up.
However, by this point it didn't matter. The recommendations were given by the government and the public followed. Vegetable oils rich in polyunsaturated fat began to flood the market as saturated fat-rich foods became progressively less prominent in the average American diet. The government nor organizations like the American Heart Association were interested in telling people that they were wrong. There would have been outrage for giving the recommendations in the first place. Instead, we are left to wonder how many lives could have been saved if not for the pride and money that controlled these organizations. Ivan France's son said his father, the principal investigator on the Minnesota experiment, was always committed to discovering the truth. He would be pleased this is finally coming out. Sorry, Bob, but what the are you talking about? Your dad quite literally hid the evidence and still had it lying in his old basement. Did he just leave it down there and suddenly forget about it? Or did the data fairy take it and hide it from him? Your father would not be pleased. He would be pissed off that you finally took your head out of your ass and uncovered the holy grail of nutrition science that he hid from the world 40 years ago. He was not the unbiased saint you think he was. He was an egotistical psychopath that put his own agenda ahead of science and public health. The largest and most well-designed study to ever be done on the diet heart hypothesis would have massively swung the decision on the recommendations in 1977, and he damn well knew that. And Ancel Keys, the man who worked so hard to make sure his hypothesis was accepted by the masses, his name didn't even end up on the study. He couldn't handle the truth and didn't want to associate with anything that didn't agree with his theory.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Okay, let me calm down. Let's get an idea on the scope of how much data was excluded. The original Minnesota coronary experiment, which didn't even get published until 16 years after the experiment ended, had 4,393 total patients. That would have already been one of the largest controlled nutrition trials in history. But when Ramsden recovered all of the missing data and did his updated analysis, a total of 9,423 participants. You heard that right. In the original experiment, the authors excluded more than half of the participants, 53% to be exact. The American Heart Association and the government dietary guidelines to this day still recommend limiting saturated fat intake and increasing polyunsaturated fats.
The American Heart Association recommends eating a healthy dietary pattern that includes good, unsaturated fats, limits saturated fats, and keeps trans fats as low as possible.
In 2017, they conducted a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials defending this position. A meta-analysis pools together the findings of all the available evidence, excludes ones that don't meet their criteria, and uses the remaining to attempt to draw a more accurate conclusion. The AHA's meta-analysis conveniently excluded the Minnesota Coronary Survey because of the short duration, large percentage of withdrawals from the study, and intermittent treatment, as well as the use of lightly hydrogenated corn oil margarine in the polyunsaturated fat diet. This type of margarine contains trans-linoleic acid, the type of trans fatty acid most strongly associated with coronary heart disease. Well, we already know that the control diet had significantly more trans fat, so that's a moot point, but these other reasons seem to make sense. Too short and some confounders. Wait, I'm sorry. I can't believe I was about to give the AHA credit for being unbiased. Let's look at the studies that they did include. They included just 4 trials, with there being at least a dozen to pick from. These were the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study, the Oslo Diet Heart Study, the Medical Research Council Study, and the Finnish Mental Hospital Study. First off, the Finnish Mental Hospital Study was not a randomized control trial. They fed the control diet to one hospital and the cholesterol-lowering diet to the other. That's not randomization. Randomization would have been if each hospital had people eating both diets. Why does this matter? Well, as our buddy Christopher Ramsden pointed out in his own meta-analysis, critically, the cardiotoxic antipsychotic medication thioridazine was used disproportionately in one study arm. Hospital and patients received an average of 100 milligram doses of thioridazine per day, more than twice as much as patients in the other 3 study arms. Yes, the hospital eating more saturated fat also received the medication that is known to cause heart disease. How's that for confounding? The AHA doesn't even acknowledge this in their paper. Next, we have the Oslo Diet Heart Study, which is also plagued by confounding. While this study was properly randomized, it wasn't just a swap in fats. The experimental group also had restricted refined grains and sugar, increased fruit and vegetable consumption, increased fish consumption, and were administered free sardines canned in cod liver oil. Without getting too much into the science, these are all protective against heart disease and beneficial for health in general. Remember, this is included in a meta-analysis that claims to exclude studies with confounding variables. Next up is the Medical Research Council study, which isn't plagued by confounders. Only one problem: there was no difference in the two studied groups. The American Heart Association even admits that there was no difference. Finally, the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. Besides the Minnesota Coronary Survey, it is the only double-blinded randomized controlled trial testing the diet heart hypothesis and was the longest study of all. Unfortunately, even though the randomization was supposed to even out the confounding variables between groups, the high saturated fat group had twice as many heavy smokers and 60% the amount of moderate smokers as the vegetable oil group. The saturated fat group also had a diet that was significantly lower in vitamin E to polyunsaturated fat ratio. Vitamin E is an antioxidant that protects against lipid peroxidation, the mechanism by which polyunsaturated fats are supposed to do their damage. What is one of the most potent activators of lipid peroxidation? Cigarette smoking. That's a double whammy. The only findings of statistical significance were cardiovascular deaths and all other causes of death. While the vegetable oil group did have fewer deaths due to heart disease, they also had higher rates of death due to other causes, the biggest contributing factor of that being deaths due to cancer. Even with vitamin E deficiency and more cigarette smoking, the saturated fat group still had less cancer, which for some reason gets ignored. The trend did not appear significant until about 6 years into the study, which really makes you wonder what would have happened if these other trials were longer. At the very least, it should make clear that we still don't know the whole story. Overall, the groups in the LA Veteran Study had no difference in total mortality. Clearly, the AHA has to defend their long-standing opinion to avoid criticism as well as to please their corporate sponsors. None of these studies were perfect, but to act as if they only included studies with no confounders when they excluded well-controlled studies that didn't fit their agenda is asinine. Many review papers have included the totality of the evidence or had a different exclusion criteria and found no difference or in some cases even a benefit of saturated fat intake. While a meta-analysis is supposed to pool the evidence together to form a conclusion, they can be easily manipulated depending on the quality of evidence and the selection bias. This further adds to the immense importance of the Minnesota and Sydney experiments. Our buddy Chris Ramsden and his team did their own meta-analysis on the topic, and we know by now that these people actually acknowledge quality evidence. Their main conclusion? Randomized controlled trials that substituted mixed omega-6/omega-3 polyunsaturated fat in place of total fat and saturated fat reduced coronary heart disease risk. By contrast, omega-6 specific polyunsaturated fat interventions tended to increase coronary heart disease risk. Many of the trials that showed benefit from omega-6 heavy vegetable oils also increased omega-3 fat consumption, which is also protective against excess omega-6. There you have it, the story of how financial and personal interests trumped science and led to a generation of chronic disease. George Mann, who was outspoken against the dietary guidelines established in 1977, later stated that the diet heart hypothesis is the greatest scam ever perpetrated on the American public. Once again, George, I couldn't agree with you more. Today, we are in a society where saturated fat and cholesterol leading to heart disease is not a hypothesis. It's a common sense fact.
I know how afraid you were after your heart attack.
Now there's wonderful news.
Now, for people who've had a heart attack and have normal cholesterol, Provocol has just been proven to reduce the risk of a stroke or mini-stroke by 26%.
Remember, I'm your kid brother.
It's hard for me to imagine you not being here in my world.
And Provocol also reduces the risk of having another heart attack by 24%.
This message is for my brother,
My husband. My father. Grandpa, I'm saving the first dance for you at my wedding.
Provocol.
At least, that's what they want you to think. Today, people that argue against this fact are shunned and sometimes prosecuted.
There's nothing more threatening than the truth, particularly in the case of big business and science.
I tweeted in response to a request about infant feeding, and I said, a key is to wean baby onto LCHF.
If you give medical advice online, this might establish a doctor-patient relationship already.
This was a tweet.
And the email evidence we have is that they decided that they were going to take me out in some way, however they could do it. And so for 7 words, a case was brought against me. And we have now been through 3 years of a trial, 26 days in court, and a very, very argumentative story. This was meant to be an investigation, a hearing, where the committee would listen to both sides of the argument and then make a decision. And the reality was never like that. The goal was to find me guilty.
There is far too much money involved in the food, pharmaceutical, dietitian, and health insurance industries that it is nearly impossible to expect change. The elites of society currently have too much control over big business, media, government, and ultimately policy. What you can do is continue to educate yourself and your peers on the proper human diet and stop giving your hard-earned money to massive multinational food and pharma companies. Do your own research, form your own opinions, and don't get suckered into the propaganda we are constantly drowned in. We have multiple videos talking about corruption as well as what is actually causing disease to get you guys started. Don't let them fool you. Subscribe to our channel.